Well, it's been a long time now since I've seen you smile, and I'll gamble away my fright, and I'll gamble away my time, and in a year or so, it's so simple to see, but it's been a long time since I've seen you smile.
Je t'assure que Victor... Non, laisse-moi! Qu'est-ce que tu as aujourd'hui?
J'ai que les hommes me dégoûtent. J'en ai que ça.
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen you smile, and I'll gamble away my fright, and I'll gamble away my time, and in a year or so, it's no simple to see, but it's been a long time since I've seen you smile. Francisco.
That's okay. I was bored anyway.
I left my love in a field.
That's okay. I was born in LA.
And we were stating on this hill that Jesus came from Israel. Eyes above a sacred cow, so not to wake a sparrow splashing. But that was many years from now, and I hope from here on out I always seem to want to shout. Your eyes are like a cup of tea, ascending to the sun with me. You swimming upstream, or just tuning into the new sensations. I was broken, you were broken. I left my love in San Francisco.
That's okay. I was bored anyway.
I left my love in the room.
That's okay. I was born in LA.
I left my love in San Francisco.
That's okay. I was bored anyway.
I left my love in a field.
That's okay. I was born in LA.
to speak from the podium, gentlemen?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, no, I'll just...
Yeah, do you want to start?
Hello? Yeah, well, why don't I just quickly start? Do you want me to...
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? All right, a little bit. Should we turn it up a notch? Okay, the gang is going to try to turn it up. Okay, so many apologies. Some of you saw that I just pulled in. I had a chance to ask a question to the excellent paper, even though I only saw maybe one slide. But it was a very nice paper in the SPY tradition. So gosh, I've been on a tour. I gave 14 talks in 14 days across 5 countries, and now I'm back, and it's really nice to be here with SPY. As Amir mentioned this morning, we're going to do this next year in Chicago, and that I think is going to be our 10-year anniversary of our relationship. So we're planning on doing something really big, like really, really big, right? Like as Trump would say, really, really big. Today, though, I don't want to foreshadow what we're going to do here at lunch. What we're going to try to put forward is a discussion that, let's say, takes advantage of what I think is our comparative advantage. I think there is no other conference in the world that combines the practitioners who are on the ground and want to change the world on the ground with the top minds in the academy who also want to change the world. Now, I want to have a frank discussion with all of you about essentially how come together we are not changing the world more than we currently are. I want to talk about the incentives that the academics have. I want to talk about the incentives that the practitioners have. And I think it's useful to every now and then have these kinds of conversations because in the end of the day, SPY was created for partnerships. It was created because Amir and I and others on the team feel that there are just tremendous gains to trade. There are top academic minds who are chomping at the bit to work with real-world data in real-world organizations to change the world. And I hope that there's a demand from the practitioners for the ideas and the science that we can bring. Okay, so how I want to start the lunch panel is to first have my 2 compatriots introduce themselves to the group, and then I will give roughly a 10-minute overview. It will sort of be about how I got here and how I think about philanthropy, but I think it also might be worth going through these 5 or 6 slides because in a way they level set and they give us a sense about what I think field experiments and economics and the scientific method can do in this space. Okay, so before I get started, I would just like to turn it over to my friends and they can go ahead and introduce themselves. I know you know one of them well, but go ahead and introduce yourselves and then we'll get started.
Well, I'll give the floor to Stephanie, please. Thank you for being with us, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Stephanie Fritz. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Intelligence and Information for United Way of Central Indiana. We are a fairly large United Way that serves Indianapolis, but a 7-county service area. So basically Marion County here in Indiana and then 6 counties around us. And being a part of Strategic Intelligence Information means that I have the wonderful position to actually be on a data team. So I lead our data analytics, and we have 3 areas of community research, impact research, and over the past year and a half, fundraising research. So I get to work with some of my wonderful colleagues. Martin Bout is in the room today. So working with a variety of fundraising analytics to help engage our workplace fundraising, our grant fundraising, and our individual and transformational fundraising. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and representing the practitioners on the panel. I'm kind of in between John and Stephanie because I wear both hats, but I just, you've heard from me this morning, but please be thinking about your partnerships as you're listening to John, giving you the level setting of people that many of you have already signed up to partner. Many of you are looking for potential matches to be made. So one of the virtues of the conference is that it's intimate enough that hopefully you will be able to meet and actually connect face-to-face with somebody who is interested in being your counterpart. So welcome again, and again, thanks for being with us.
All right, thanks, Amir. I'm going to take issue with one thing that my friend just said. I am also a practitioner, and I wear those stripes very proudly. So I think I'm both. I hope I'm both. I've been working on trying to raise money for over 25 years now, and you'll hear some of that in these slides. So I want to consider myself a practitioner too, and a user of science. Okay, so what I have up here is, I think the way an economist would think about the market for charity is up here. And in a way, an economist would think, well, this market has three players. It has a government, which of course helps to set rules, marginal tax rates, rules on charitable giving. It transfers money to charitable organizations. It has charitable organizations, and it has individuals. The research that most of you will see here, and most of all goes on in SPY, is that bottom relationship. And I would call that the demand side of charitable giving. It's the relationship between individuals and 501c3s. That doesn't mean that other parts of the triangle aren't interesting. A lot of people in this room have worked on different problems around government rules and regulations and transfer payments, et cetera. But really what you're going to find are questions like, how do we expand the charitable pie? We were just in a session where the last speaker was talking about what are the underpinnings for generosity, and can we predict these types of generous acts? Okay, so for me, my research agenda actually began when I was an assistant professor back at the University of Central Florida. And this was all the way back to 1997. There was a knock on my door, and it was the dean. I was in the business school at the University of Central Florida as an assistant professor. And he told me that he wanted me to start a Center for Environmental Policy Analysis. And he said, as the founder of this center, I want you to raise money for the center. Remember, this is a 26-year-old assistant professor. And I said, look, I know nothing about raising money. So he said, well, just think about it and come back to me in a month or so and tell me what you want to do. So during that time, I ended up going down the path of, can I find really good science that will help me answer this simple question? If I am after resources for a large capital project, what is the best way to raise money? So of course I called the experts. One expert said, John, in private, raise 20% of your goal. And then once you raise 20%, announce it and go for the other 80%. And I said, what is the evidence that that's a good strategy? That's what he said. So then I went to the next one. He said, John, you need to raise 40 to 60% of your goal privately before you go public. And I said, what is your empirical evidence for that? There's none. It's gut. It's a gut feeling. We make a lot of decisions, whether it's in philanthropy, in the government, in the privates, we make a lot of gut decisions. So I started to think, It doesn't need to be gut. We could actually add science around that question. And that's exactly what we did in that first set of field experiments. We varied the level of seeds, and we explored whether the level of seed money affected future giving. And it does. And that's a paper that was published in 2001. So now doing that, you start to think about other questions. You start to think, well, if you just announce seeds, that we have seed money, and now we want to raise more money, that's an unconditional way to use seeds. Maybe it would have been better if you would do it in a conditional sense. So I consulted the experts. And here's what Kent Dove wrote back in 2000. Obviously, a one-to-one match, every dollar that the donor gives is matched by another dollar, is more appealing than a 1-to-2 challenge. But a richer challenge, 2-to-1, greatly adds to the match's attractiveness. We all hear this. And I call that the Snickers bar statement. Because if we are buying Snickers bars, we know that the law of demand typically holds. That statement from Kent Dove is basically the law of demand. Increased price, quantity demanded goes down. Decreased price, i.e. a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 match, the price of giving has effectively gone down, so you purchase more. So then I started asking around, what is the evidence that we have around the match level and the match's attractiveness? And there wasn't a lot. So then that became a research agenda. And this is a simple experiment with the ACLU. They were sending solicitation letters to households anyway. So the value proposition is, why not continue to send the letters in the exact same way that you always do, but just allow us to change one of the paragraphs? We're not asking for something big. We just want to learn about whether a match works. So they agreed. And this is one part of the study that we had roughly 50,000 households, and we randomized them into one of these 4 groups. The letters are identical, except if you have a match, we say it's 1-to-1, 2-to-1, or 3-to-1. We are essentially testing the law of demand with charitable giving. Here's what happens. So if I just look at group 4, remember, which was the no match treatment, and compare it to the match treatments, I find something glorious. You raise nearly 20% more just by having a match available. And what's interesting is that effect occurs entirely on the extensive margin. What I mean by that is more people give. So the people who were going to give don't give more, but more people join the pyramid. That's pretty cool. Now it's time to answer the match rate question. What do you think is going to happen? So on my next click, I'm going to show results on 3-to-1 versus 2-to-1 versus 1-to-1. How many of you think, with a raise of hands, that 3-to-1 will raise the most money? Raise your hand. Few. Well, raise your hand high. Be proud. Okay, how many think 2-to-1, 3-to-1, that's going to be much better than 1-to-1? Raise your hand. Okay, good. Here's what happens. There are no additional dollars raised with higher match rates. 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1, they all bring in the same amount of money. And we can extend this all the way down to 1-to-3. It's not a general result because I can't go to 1-to-100, right? Or I can't go up to 100-to-1 because that's going to be fishy. But over the relevant range of parameters, we've just learned a lot about why are people giving and how should we be using our match dollars. Now, fast forward, and some insights that jump out over it. I've talked a little bit about my work, but all of you have contributed to this area. Some insights that jump out is upfront money is vital. Whether it's a capital campaign for a capital project or for marginal expenses, upfront money is vital. The way you use the upfront money is important. Sometimes seeds, unconditional grants, are better than matches. In our research, it all depends on the uncertainty of the quality of the good. And there's been some work that's replicated that. Okay, when quality is uncertain, use seeds. Matches are good, but be very careful about using matches that are above 1-to-1. By and large, I think for most campaigns, that will be a waste of money, a waste of match dollars. Small donor gifts, we all talk about these. Another way to use upfront money, not unconditional seed, not conditional matches, but a donor gift. That's another usage. What we find is that a small donor gift can substitute for having a warm list. We all know the difference between a warm list and a cold list. And it's really important to build a donor pyramid to make sure we have a big warm list of people. What we find is cold list people with a small gift give at the same rates as warm list people without a gift. Okay, so small gifts can really matter on the extensive margin. And then when you think about incentives in general, that's what economists and behavioral scientists are good at. We always have to think not only about what are these incentives going to do today in this fundraising drive, but also what's going to happen tomorrow. So always have these outcome measures that are not only within the campaign, but also in the long run. Now, those are scientific insights. When I talk to organizations, the typical response is, it worked in that case, but it's not going to work for my cause and for my people. I totally get that. That's the old external validity argument that we commonly face in the academy. It worked in your setting, it's a very special situation, it won't work in mine. We argue because different populations of people in different populations of situations. Okay, that's typically what I hear. And that's when we get down this far. A lot of times people say, well, the science doesn't really apply to me. But what I've talked about so far, it's hard to argue how you use matches or how you use upfront seeds, that doesn't matter to you. So that line of defense could be, it just doesn't apply to my situation. That problem is a problem that every organization faces. That problem is not novel to what we're trying to do in philanthropy. I'm the chief economist at Walmart. We have the same problem. It works in Vermont. Will it work in Austin? At Uber and Lyft, when I worked there, same problem. That product was great in Seattle. Is it going to work in Chicago? But that doesn't stop us from exploring whether it works. That's another exploration. And science gives you ideas to test. We all roll out new things. I urge you that when you roll out new things, be a scientist. Even if you don't have scientists in your org, you can still think like a scientist or use this network to help you think about treatment arms and what you should be exploring. Now, let's think about horizontal scaling, because I would argue that there have been certain, let's say, laws that one might argue will transfer across settings and populations of people. And that's about the underpinnings of why somebody gives. For example, men are more price sensitive than women. That's a result that I find nearly every time. Two types of prices. You have match rates, that changes prices, and you have tax rates. That changes prices. So that's two ways to think about price effects. Another one is, what about why people give? Well, there's a lot of evidence in our data that women give more because of altruism and social pressure and social cues. So the choice architecture is much more important for women than men. That's what that suggests. Men give because of prices and warm glow. Now, given that, I start to think, well, what would we do? When I was back at Uber or Lyft or Walmart, I'm good at getting jobs. I'm really hard at keeping them. So now I happen to be at Walmart. I say, well, what would we do in that situation? It's really clear. At all three of those orgs, what we would do is we would use the literature to inform us, the literature that speaks directly to what we're trying to do, and then we would go ahead and when we introduce things and change things or try things, we would approach it in an experimental way. And then we would learn where and why and when it works with our subject pool and our situations. Now that's the demand side of charitable giving. You could also think about the supply side. So the supply side, which all of you should also be thinking about, is, does what I provide change the world? Am I having an impact? I'm raising all this money, great, and I'm getting paid, and I'm incentivized to raise more money because that's something that's measurable. But then you should ask yourself, what about on the supply side? Are the goods and services that we're providing actually doing good? And do we have evidence for that? What I find is if you find you have evidence for that, it's easier to take it back to the donors and say, look, we've been scientists and we've explored whether our programs or services are working, and here's how they're working. That's also a scientific question that everybody in this room can help you answer. Scientific evidence and the scientific approach works on the demand side and it works on the supply side. Now, my last slide here, you can say, I'm just going to add a little bit of parochial stuff and say, what does it take to have high voltage in your philanthropy? I think it's really 3 steps. One is you have to define outcome metrics. Whether you're raising money or you're exploring the effects of the supply side or the effects of your goods and services, a lot of orgs I work with have a really hard time articulating what is my outcome metric. For example, when I work with Make-A-Wish, Make-A-Wish is a wonderful organization, but they have a hard problem because they're not going to extend life days. That's not what that's about. So what you have to do is you have to change it and say, well, let's measure smiles or happiness in the last 2 weeks of life. And then that's now the value proposition. What are the best types of Make-A-Wish approaches can we have that maximizes happiness of not only the child, but the parents and the siblings? Those are outcome metrics. You have to define, when you help to define what your org is about, you help to define what are the outcome metrics that you care about. I understand some of them are hard to measure, but you should always try to measure. 2, I think the design is important and to think about this scientifically. Most of the time when I work with orgs and I say, well, give me the data that you have, they typically don't have what's called a counterfactual or a control group. And that will get you nearly every time because then you might as well just guess with your gut. If you don't have a counterfactual, don't have a control group, it's akin to just saying, this is my gut, this is what my boss used to do. Secondly, I think there's a lack of thought, and this is where the group in here can come and help, because we have reams of journal articles that have interesting hypotheses that have been found to work in the lab or in a specific setting. Having that knowledge and bringing it to your org, I think, can be exceptionally helpful. Lack of replication. Don't just try it once. Try it a few times and make sure that you replicate and augment. If you get in the constant habit of I'm going to replicate what we found to make sure it's the truth, and then I'm going to augment it and see if I can improve upon it, that can work. It's exactly what we did with Smile Train when we first started working with them. They were sending 1 million letters a month. And they said, John, we don't need your help because we've been constantly experimenting. But we were able to bring in insights from our literature, which they were not aware of, to augment the letters that they always sent out. It's called Once and Done if you want to take a look at it in the literature. And Once and Done ends up working very effectively with many orgs, including Smile Train. Mediation and moderators. These are scientific terms that we don't need to understand, but it's for me to tell you a mediator is about why something's happening. Why are people giving to this campaign? Because of that letter. The moment you can determine the whys behind something, which experiments are very good at helping you determine, now you can start talking about generalizing those insights. The moderators are simply men and women act differently. It's an age effect. It's a race effect. It's a variable that affects how effective your drive is. But a moderator is exogenous to the system, okay, like gender. Now, I oftentimes see people, when they do science, they really don't have a plan for the results. Always understand, what am I going to do with these results? If I get one type of result, what does that mean? If I get another type, what does that mean? And then have a path for where that science is going to take you. And this isn't very hard to do, and your academic partners can really help. I'm going to end there and say thanks so much for attending SPI. And I'm going to turn it over to my compatriots.
Well, thank you, John. Well, that was a terrific beginning of kind of explaining the underlying code of SPI and why we're here and the successes we have to build on. I just want to ask our colleagues in the control booth or audio that, if we could prepare a mic that we can share with the audience in about 5-10 minutes, that would be great. But let's turn to Stephanie and ask her, I know she's prepared a little bit of thinking about what kind of research is helpful to her as a practitioner, and no less somebody who is in charge of disseminating and gathering in data and research that she then shares with her organization and the many nonprofits that she seeks to nurture.
So United Way of Central Indiana we fund over 300 nonprofits each year through different means of grant making. But then we also have this arm of raising money. We have this dual focus of making impact in the community and raising money. So in that space, a lot of the things that you were saying with our impact work, John, it was resonating so much in the sense of a lot of times we are so busy doing the work that it is very hard to make a pause to be intentional about how we are assessing our impact. While we do have very defined outcome metrics, but when you're talking about a control group, replication, that is a challenge we experience as well. So when I came here about what type of research was interesting to me, especially in the world of our fundraising, with the fundraising area that I work in, all of it is so fascinating right now. The challenge that we experience is making it applicable, having those actionable insights that we can then relate to our fundraisers. Because a lot of times when a campaign season kicks off, so right now we're in the middle of campaign season, and it is so busy to even get FaceTime sometimes with some of our frontline fundraisers who are doing the work day in and day out. And they are operating at such a high velocity and working so hard to make their goals happen and to get that money in the door, that a lot of times it does result in them operating off of gut. So basically taking the time and being that bridge between the scientific research and the applied. So we were talking about, in all the presentations I heard today, there was almost a part of me that was like, oh, I wish there was kind of what you did, John, of here's the steps for the practitioner. Here's 1, 2, 3. Another thing that I wonder is sometimes when you're doing experiments and you have so much control, nonprofits, a lot of times they work in a space where they don't have robust data. They don't have access to big data. They don't have access to complete data sets. So even if you're in a space where United Way, we really uphold ourselves on the data that we're collecting, but when I represent the other nonprofits in Central Indiana, where in Central Indiana, 30% of the nonprofits have a budget of $1 million or less. a lot of times that means that they might have 1, 2 employees, right? And that's considered good in this space. It is very hard to then go to them and say, how are you assessing your data quality? How are you ensuring that you have control groups? How are you ensuring that you're approaching it this way? And I think that there's a lot of possibilities to make that connection to help them, because they are in it to serve individuals. They're here to serve their community. And asking somebody who might be the primary fundraiser for that organization, who may also be the operations person, or a lot of times if they're the data person, they're also maybe an assistant that's also helping, or helping being a case manager at the same time, wearing those multiple hats. It's really hard for them to pause to like access the science, to apply that science to maybe their system, because that's the other thing, is like they look at things where there are control groups and there is robust data, saying, well, how does that apply to me when I don't even know this information about my clientele, or I don't know this information about my donors, or I'm just trying to get food in the arms of people and raise money to get the food in the arms of people, so.
Great. But somebody is learning how to do this work somewhere, so they learn how to do the work. And so how do you interrupt people kind of believing rules of thumb that are not supported and are not evidence-based, right?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, like, because people who are coming into this work, and again, I'm only one sector in this industry, right? United Way of Central Indiana is even an intermediate in this space. We're very fortunate that we have access to a large fundraising team, and we're able to recruit very talented people who attended the Lilly School, and we're able to learn really good, robust practices in this. I think if you're thinking about other nonprofits in this space, a lot of times they fall into it, They came into this and they're passionate about making a help in the community, and then they have affinities for doing this type of work and to doing fundraising in that space, and they skill up and they're learning along the way. And sometimes, as you know, if you're not introduced to science and rigor and what could be adapted, then it isn't implemented. I think something, when you were saying for people to engage more with the community, I think initiatives like this, I think the grants that SPI rolled out where they said they wanted to make partnerships and fund that work, I think that is absolutely something that can be introduced to support that. Because what's happening is a lot of nonprofits, they're actually being recruited by consultants, because they're the ones who are able to have the time to access this information, and then they sell this knowledge under products that they've developed for consultants to partner with. And nonprofits a lot of times are seeking consultant partners. So I think that there's initiatives like this would be a really good idea. I think continuing to make research available, and again, also disseminate in a way that's very applied and accessible to nonprofits, would be another way to help bridge that gap.
I like looking at that. I mean, in some ways, in this room, we're trying to disintermediate the consulting ecosystem to some degree, so that you don't have the loss in translation between the folks who develop the research, the people who interpret it and then convey it to the nonprofits. So maybe we can ask, how many practitioners do we have in the room? And how many of you have filled out the form that we sent out with a kind of a specific sense of how you would like help from an academic? The practitioners. Would you like to talk a little bit about what kind of help you were looking for? Do we have if you don't mind me putting you on the spot? We're all family here.
I hope you told her before.
No, you can pass. You can pass. Yeah.
Suzanne, are you talking to me?
Yeah. Do we have a microphone?
Yeah, maybe get a hot mic.
Thank you. Hello. I'm Allison. I'm the director of the Hancock Health Foundation. We are in the county just east of Indianapolis, and Hancock County is actually the fastest growing county in the state. And so our hospital system is growing rapidly to continue to meet healthcare needs in the area. And our foundation has been primarily focused, our donor base and our volunteers have been focused in Greenfield, which is the county seat, but the area, that is not the fastest growing area of the county. So I'm really interested in kind of testing out different engagement efforts and different types of appeals and things like that as we're trying to expand our donor base in other areas of the county to follow along with the way that the healthcare system is expanding in those areas. So that's where I'm hoping maybe to partner to do some experiments and learn some things in that area.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for being so brave, and my apologies for putting you on the spot, but that's wonderful. So Allison from Hancock County. So all of you researchers who have an interest, you might make sure to connect with her and talk about more specifics. Anybody else in the practitioner community who would like to share what they're specifically doing, or it doesn't have to be specific a specific project, what you are wondering about, and in terms of the way Stephanie has talked about some of the difficulties, are there specific successes perhaps you'd like to share?
I would not like to talk about successes, but I am Hope Crenshaw. I'm the Executive Director of Teen Health Mississippi, and I'm with the Fidelity Charitable Program that's focused on the U.S. South, Southeast specifically. And my question is, given that the U.S. Southeast gets 3% of the philanthropic contributions, how do we best position organizations like Teen Health Mississippi and others who we're focused on individual giving, but in addition, we really have to be focused on larger giving as well? And how do we, I think on some level there has to be a change in tide in how larger foundations approach the U.S. South, but also some very strategic ideas that are based in the literature but has a specific understanding of the U.S. South and the issues related to giving in those areas.
Well, that's it. To your point, John, that's a question of applicability, right, and generalizability also. This Seattle is going to work somewhere else. Do you have any thoughts?
No, I think so I have a caveat to start. I've never done work directly in the South. My email's open. I do think, though, the point that you raised, so I do work with the IRS data, and when you look at, let's say, the distribution of giving at the individual level and how that's changed over time and how concentrated it has become, I think when you mentioned in the South you want to focus on big donors, I think that's all over. That's ubiquitous. And when you have data like our data would say, the top 1,000 givers in the U.S. are giving 13% of the charitable contributions in the U.S. of those who file taxes. So that's 1,032 people giving 13%. And the top 1% are giving 42% of the gifts. So those types of trends are all across the U.S. I do think that the science that you'll see presented in the science that I've talked about, I think that works in the South. The big hanging chad is, does that science work with big donors? And there's not a lot of evidence around what are the motivations for large donors. We have one paper which Mark handled at the Journal. At Chibo, we're doing a specialist, so, well, you two guys both handled it, right, with Luigi. I wrote a paper that explored large donors at Booth Business School at the University of Chicago. So these were people who had the capacity to give $20 million a year or something like that. And by and large, the evidence from the smaller donors did generalize, but that's like one study. And that part is still a blind spot in the literature for two reasons. One, there aren't a lot of them to give you data in terms of data points that are usable. And then secondly, once somebody has them, they do not want to release them to a scientist or to a researcher, right? It's like crazy that University of Chicago Business School released their donors to me and let me do some experiments with them. But by and large, those are groups there's been a dearth of evidence on why they're giving, at least in the experimental level. There's more evidence around tax law changes, and then how do those changes affect that type of giving.
I will only add also, and if Tony wants to chime in as well, the Fidelity Charitable Catalyst Fund support of our effort, I think is really interesting. And I think what you brought up, I hope, about the Southeast is also, I think, built into the notion of science as being public knowledge. There's a lot of very large nonprofits that can hire people to help kind of create private knowledge for them in the sense that they can hire consultants to look at the patterns that are happening in their data. They often don't share that data broadly, right? That becomes kind of private knowledge that's within their operational work. So I think part of our puzzle that we're trying to solve is how do smaller nonprofits who are in resource-constrained environments, which is the vast majority of nonprofits in the United States, that represent kind of the democratic base of the nonprofit sector. It recalls the Generosity Commission release yesterday that was bemoaning the loss of the everyday donor. We're seeing everyday donors less prominent and John mentioned that as well, the 1,000 families accounting for so much. Those everyday donors accounting for less of the overall giving pie. So how do we use this knowledge that's available to everybody, in particular resource-constrained nonprofits? What can they do to go to the next step? How can they reach bigger donors, be more systematic in reaching out to everyday donors? I think you put your finger on kind of a really important puzzle in research. And we saw also this morning in the panel a really interesting story about the concentration of private grant-making dollars, even more concentrated than NSF and NIH giving, which was really interesting to see. So there's the public nature of science, I think, is also very interesting because this is knowledge that becomes accessible to everybody. It's not just that kind of private knowledge that makes you know somebody who knows a very wealthy person who can help you at the end of the day. So.
Can I add one more? Because I think you were dissatisfied a bit with my answer, and I probably would have been too. If you go to this paper actually does have a map of the different counties in America and how the people who live there are affected by match rates. And the map, most importantly, shows that whether you're a blue or red county, that really influenced how you were affected by the match rate. So as you mentioned the South, you might want to take a look at, if you can't find this, just email me, I'll shoot it to you. And there you might learn some interesting, let's say, insights about the particular people who you're tapping.
Sorry, something else. When you were talking about this, there was a research that I just saw at the Association for Prospect Research, APRA, and they were discussing about how exploration, especially entrepreneurs and first-time wealth builders in a family, you have to look at alternative indicators for wealth because some of the prospect screening tools, there might be biases implicated in that. So some of the research is going about like how do we look at alternative indicators or engagement in the community in different ways to increase our understanding of a population that might not pop up on the radar within like wealth screens or in that space, but engage a new population that are growing and are heavily committed in the community and may be a good resource and potential donors. So.
Thank you. think we had Tony over there.
Yeah, so glad that we have folks from Mississippi represented. Tony Bowen, I lead the Catalyst Fund. I think one of the experiments that could be run that we've been interested as we talk to nonprofits like we have here today is what are some different appeals that you could run by people that do not live in a state to get them to give to a different state where there's a higher socioeconomic need than where you currently are. So how do you do some ABC testing on that? And then likewise, how do you get quote unquote expats who have left a state to give back to their state? Because in the South in particular, we talk to folks and donors all the time that say, yeah, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and now I live in Chicago, now I live in LA. And so what are different tweaks that we could make in fundraising language to get those two populations? Because our entire strategy is get more money to nonprofits that are in the South and the Mountain West. And I'm often asked, how are you going to do that, Tony? And it's like, there's either two strategies. You get the people that live there to be more philanthropic towards community-based organizations, or you get money to come in. And so that just could be some experiments that academics could run.
That's interesting.
That's a good point. As you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about in higher education, you have an undergrad, and then if that's their last point of education, they're prime. But if they go to grad, let's say they go get an MBA. Now, the MBA is kind of a place where the money goes, and the undergrad is sort of forgotten. So it's the same type of problem that you're talking about in terms of some kind of last touch, and then how do you get them back? So I did several experiments with my alma mater, UW Stevens Point, so I'm a Wisconsin guy. And what I did is I personalized the message and said, since you graduated in 2012, today we're asking for $20.12, and et cetera, et cetera. It was just an effort to try to change the donor base, and that kind of personalization actually worked. And if you email me, I can send you that paper.
That's great. Gentleman over there.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a newcomer of this initiative. I'm Marcos Kissel from São Paulo, Brazil, University of São Paulo. And at this point, I am in a new initiative that is led by we have a level we call the Institute of Advanced Studies at the university. And in this group, we create a group to study philanthropy and science. And in this group, we are seeing two key issues, and maybe I will be changing the way that the talking is taking place now for the US. First, all countries in Latin America, and I was the director for the region for Kellogg Foundation for 15 years, we found that the presence of a government is much bigger than we can consider in a situation like the US, including in funding research. The second question is, normally the science is something that comes from universities, and it comes from federal or state level universities. So professors work as a servant, public servant, as part of this structure. So they want that the money coming from the budget of the government for the research. They don't have the experience to bring the private sector to help in building support to science. So my question has two key points in what you said. First, we are still in your first part of your design. We didn't move it to the second one. Yes. We are still in this reason, government, science, and they find what could be between people and charities. And the second, we are struggling to see if you have a science of philanthropy, or philanthropy is just the result of the other science. So the way that you are pursuing, it's clear that we could build a science of philanthropy. But I want to know how far we are today to make the distinction between the initiatives that come from other science and something that is starting to come from the science of philanthropy. So this is my point. Thank you very much for the stage.
Okay, so thanks. And also thanks for coming and attending the conference. And I think the group that you've created or helped create, I think should certainly be a partner of ours. We would love to do more activities. So let's get to brass tacks. Let's talk about your last point. When you look at the tools of people who work in this area, I think people use the scientific method in terms of, let's call it, field experimentation and lab experimentation. The ratio would be a lot larger in this space than in other parts of the social sciences. That would be one point. Have there been innovations? I think some. When you think about short panels or some of the work we've been doing lately on combining ML with experimentation, I think those have been general advances that people outside of philanthropy can use. When you talk about modeling, some people in this room have generated new models to help think about why are people giving to these types of causes, what keeps them committed to the causes, and then also, let's say, creating theoretical predictions that can be tested. And those tools and those ideas and those theories and that link between empiricism and theory is broadly applicable outside of the area of the philanthropy of science or the science of philanthropy. You can cut both ways. I think both sides are interesting. By and large, I think that this field is like other microfields in that way, but I think that we're much smaller. I think this field is much more nascent. I think where the science is today amongst academics, both empirically and theoretically, it is answering questions that a lot of practitioners don't care about. And I think that you have this disconnect, which you have in every other field too. So I don't know if that's healthy or not, but nevertheless, there is a disconnect. I'm optimistic about our field bridging that disconnect just because I do think we have so much in common and we all do speak the same language. Like when I work in IO at Walmart, when we talk about optimal pricing, if I bring in an IO guy and that IO person talks to our pricing people, they're like from two different worlds. So it's like, it's dead on arrival. I don't see that when I bring people like this together and when we have discussions. There's some disconnect, but it's not as great as other fields. But I think as we grow, one thing we have to be really careful about is we want to continue to make great scientific advances. I'm very proud of what this field's done in the last 25 years. But we also want to make sure that those advances are grounded in some type of reality where we can change the world and change the world in important ways. And I think as we grow, that's a real threat. Because that's basically what's happened in nearly every other field. In economics, at least. I can't speak to other fields, but I suspect that as you mature, you get drilling down into some hole that only 5 academics in the world will want to know about. And I think that's dangerous for a community because the road to obsolescence is just right around the corner. And I think that's why gatherings like this are really helpful to keep academics grounded and to keep them interested in the things that we should be interested in. Does that help?
I will only add from a policy perspective, often when you travel outside of the United States, philanthropy is seen as this strange American deviation from the usual government funding model of science, which is prevalent everywhere else. But there is some thoughtful consideration in terms of what it is that philanthropy funds that government and the private sector does not fund. So there are some papers with the National Bureau of Economic Research that looks at whether the proposition that philanthropy actually funds basic science in more risky ways than established agencies would not dare to do. So that's an interesting way of kind of convincing the powers that be that they should be more open to allowing philanthropy to be part of the ecosystem. And then you have to convince the culture of the professoriate that being something in addition to a civil servant with only a government salary adds something to the scientific project itself, and not simply it's not simply a surrender to the fact that we have resource constraints. So that's another potential angle. We have another question.
Yes, I'm a consultant that works with funders on their support for equity-driven investments, and I also work with nonprofits to support sustainability. So in terms of your idea of kind of bridging that gap, can you talk about leveraging the data to support storytelling? So we talk about kind of impact and what does it really mean in terms of changing the world, leveraging the data and also the capacity to tell effective stories based on the audience.
Well, storytelling tends to be very much a part, and it's, I think, part of the practitioner knowledge, if you will. But I'd love to John to talk about the difference between science and storytelling.
No, I love that question. Look, we write academic papers, we write science, but around the science is a narrative. And I think one of the biggest points of departure across academics when I read papers is I could give two different academics the exact same data set, the exact same set of results, and one would spin a fantastic narrative that would get in a top economics journal, and the other one would spin a narrative that can't get in the journal of last resort. So let's be clear that science is science, but then how you interpret it and write it up, that part of the narrative, there's a science behind that too, a science of telling a narrative and writing the paper. I do think that that's an important point, that when you have to do that when you generate resources, you have to do that when you talk to donors, right? You have to talk about this is a narrative of our organization. This is our action plan. This is how we're going to raise money. This is who we're going to approach, this is going to be our budget, and this is what we're going to spend on for next year. And let me tell you about some of the people that we're affecting. Let me tell you about Jimmy, and let me tell you about Shane, and let me tell you about how they're going to school more because of our program. Whatever your program is, there's a narrative. And every time you add, one thing we did with Smile Train is we added pictures. Smile Train's value prop is every $250 you send in, you fix a cleft palate. We ship a doctor overseas, they fix one cleft palate. Just adding the picture of this is a child who you will be helping, and we can link your $250 to that child. That's a narrative in our fundraising appeal. And then we raise 180% more money or something like that because we've spun this narrative. I don't think narratives need to be fiction. Nonfiction narratives are much more interesting to me as a scientist. So I think it is important at every level. And can academics in this room help you spin narratives to your donors, to people who are decision makers, your board? Absolutely. I think that's what academics are particularly good at, is spinning narratives around, let's say, scientific findings, because our model is we have to make them interesting to people. And if we don't make our research interesting, nobody publishes it, we don't get tenure, we don't get funding, and we become truck drivers. And I say that politely. My dad was a trucker, my grandpa's a trucker, and my brother's a trucker. It's not a bad life, I just don't want to be a trucker. But that's the people who are spinning narratives, I think you're going to find in the room. I hope that helps.
Go ahead.
So this is something that we are currently very much focused on at My United Way. Being on a data team and in the field of data analytics, that space has moved from where you might have a data storyteller that is its own entity to now being, this is a skill set that any analyst should have. And so for us, something that we focus on is our own data integrity. So making sure that you know what outcomes, what they mean, that you have trust in that information, why you're collecting it. And then also, who are you trying to communicate to? So I think you were talking about that, like with boards and with stakeholders. That is also a critical component that I think that a lot of nonprofits don't spend a lot of time thinking of. They go, well, what's our marketing material? What's our branding? But when it comes to telling the outcomes of your story, especially nonprofits, when they try to do, and this is something very specific to us, is we have a lot of programs and initiatives, and I'm looking at Martin, because trying to sell everything that we do at United Way is very challenging, because we do so much. So being able to target what the stakeholder wants to hear and what the business purpose is, and almost thinking of it from a, like I said, a business standpoint, has really helped us structure. But I think that a lot of smaller nonprofits, you still have them in the space where it is a annual report. These are our outcomes. Here's a pie chart. Here's a line chart, and this is what we've done. So telling the story around the why is so important is just as powerful as the outcomes that you're just collecting. So, and it's a challenge.
I just wanted just 1 second to add to that, because that last point was super important about if you only have one narrative, you are for sure doing it wrong. So think about, I started this early childhood program called CHECK, Chicago Heights Early Childhood Program. So if a parent community or a school board comes to me and says, Professor List, tell us about CHECK, I'll tell them about the 2,500 kids who we helped. And I'll tell them how we helped them and how proud I am to help their families. If an academic comes up to me and says, tell me about CHECK, I'll say, let me tell you about what we learned about the education production function and how we changed the education production function, what we learned, and how other people can use that. If a donor or a government official comes to me, I might say, let me tell you about how I think we created this curriculum that can scale. And we can think about horizontal scaling, we can think about vertical scaling. I've just told 3 different narratives about the exact same data set. So if you don't have multiple narratives about each particular result or goal that you have, you're not thinking about it the right way. And I do see people always telling the same narrative. It's like, dude, right? It's like, know your audience. Like, don't you understand what's going on here? So I think the biggest success around narratives or storytelling is understanding your audience and having multiple ways to spin your vignette.
And you know how you did that, though? That's a complex thought to have for thinking about the complexities of an organization. So then you couple that with nonprofits. The exit, Teresa, I think, did the interview on exit rates of nonprofits. Staffing of nonprofits, so the staff turnover is incredibly high for it's in any industry right now, but it's incredibly high for nonprofits. So when you are faced with having fundraisers or program staff who are exiting out after a year, I always say, like, whenever there's a new employee that comes to United Way, I'm like, it takes you a year to understand us, to just start to understand us. And so it's very hard to have a fundraiser come in, hit the ground running, and be able to tell the multiple different stories. And that's also, I think, when we were talking about taking it back to earlier about like how do we help bridge the gap, I think that's another important component when it comes to practitioners, especially nonprofit practitioners, that we have to keep in mind, is that we are also facing staffing challenges consistently.
Yeah. I actually thought that the exit one, which I apologize for not being here, but I'm sure it was excellent. I always thought that was that people don't appreciate how hard fundraising is. I mean, it's hard to raise money, let's be honest. So you go in for a year and you might get lucky or you might not. If you don't, then you sort of have to leave. And then people say, well, you were just investing. Yeah, but fundraising is really hard. If I stay around for 2 more years, everyone's going to say I'm not a success. But if I leave after a year, then that looks okay because I'm leaving for a better opportunity. So it feels to me that when I heard your facts, which I heard them last year and we've talked about them, I think it's because people don't appreciate the difficulty of this sector and they don't appreciate how hard it is. And in a way, if you get big gifts, which I've gotten some big gifts, it's a lot of luck. And people don't appreciate luck. So it's super hard to raise money, and then you're going to have high attrition if people don't appreciate that.
On a positive note, the ongoing entry into the sector indicates that there are these new narratives that people are hankering for, at least, right? So maybe that's a Pollyannish way of looking at it. But there's another obstacle we can solve, maybe?
Speaking on the bridge between my husband and I, retired medical academics from the R1s, including the University of Chicago, as well as now worried about philanthropy. And we believe the models are there. We have the PREVENT model for social determinants of health, looking at zip code. And by the way, we worked in Chula, Mississippi, and Trent, Kentucky. And we have URAC looking at the community health workers. So we're thinking, if we're talking over 80% of philanthropy money comes from individuals, we're wondering if we can apply the science of philanthropy more easily in foundations and corporations first, if you could apply that using zip code data. And also, if we could maybe appeal to places like URAC when they've got community health workers, if part of the training and federal designation could be they understand philanthropy.
So that sounds very reasonable to me. I think you know more about that particular sector than I do. But yeah, typically foundations have, not unlike United Way's, a lot more resources to process information and to act on it, and tend to be much more sophisticated consumers of intelligence and information. You know, they have the resources to be able to do that. They also have often incentives to be territorial and distinguish themselves, so probably under provide kind of collaboration amongst themselves. Although this morning's results were really interesting in terms of some of the overlaps that you have as well. So I talked to the fellow right behind you. I think he might have some thoughts about that as well. Are there?
Yeah, and this is a consequence of looking at UC alone. We took political pressure to get our trauma unit together, and it took political pressure, and I'm sure you can speak to this, to get our trauma unit together, and yet it serves close to 18,000 patients in the last few years. And just explaining those things to people and the zip code relationships, it's already in the PREVENT model. It's been thoroughly vetted by the American Heart Association, and URAC is already certifying community health workers. So I think we have the models there. I think it's what you said, the bridge between what we do in academia, the R1s, and what we impact in communities. This is the difficult problem we have. And I think the medical community will certainly support you, because without supporting social determinants of health, we're in a losing battle.
Let me add that, you know, a relationship made at SPY several years ago between Anya Samek and Chuck Longfield. So Chuck had a big data set on organizations and firms, and they combined forces, and it's a paper titled "Do Thank You Calls Increase Charitable Giving, Expert Forecasts, and Field Experimental Evidence?" So I do think that space is under-researched. I do think it's prime for the exact same kinds of tools that I talked about that we do with individuals, but I actually think there are some parts of it that are even richer when you talk about firm matches or community matches and local public goods versus global public goods. And there are really a lot of interesting questions within that. So I agree with you. And I don't know if any of you remember when Chuck Longfield came and gave a keynote. And that did, from that came some academic research with Anya Samek in particular.
Are there other obstacles that people are dying to express that haven't been covered in the discussion so far, especially from our practitioners, things you wish you knew how to get out of or understand better?
Hi, thank you. I had a question to address to the panel about the relationship between practitioners and academics working in the field. I think a very academic approach is often to show in different studies things that don't work. But when we partner with organizations in the field, I think it can be tricky to walk into an organization and run something with them in the field and then show, okay, now we know that didn't work, thank you, goodbye. And I wonder, how do we go about, doing research that shows, people might have gut feelings that this approach doesn't work, but we haven't got the evidence for that. How do we go about gaining that evidence, but in a way that can actually keep organizations happy and getting their own needs met in the collaboration.
Interesting.
So I'm gonna take issue with the premise. What we're trained to do is to reject theory and to reject theoretical predictions. A lot of times that comes with a rejection of a null hypothesis. That there's a zero treatment effect. When there's a zero treatment effect, that means B worked better than A. And that usually comes with a program. So usually we get published in journals when we find large treatment effects of ideas. So we find my curriculum at Czech moved standardized test scores by 0.3 standard deviations, and we plaster that all over. And that's everywhere. That's in IO, that's in labor, that's in philanthropy. I think the real disconnect is not that we're not used to having stuff that works. I think that stuff that works tends to be too narrow, and it works in a petri dish, but there's no chance that it will scale. And it's like predictably unscalable in ways that when we go out to firms, I don't think we've thought about what are the constraints that my idea will face at scale, and I should test those back in the petri dish. This is what I call option C thinking. We should do option C thinking in the petri dish and then go to firms from there. And that's the disconnect for me. It's not that we're used to saying that stuff doesn't work. We're used to saying theories don't work. We're used to saying programs do work. But I think that's too optimistic, because when they work in a petri dish, there'll typically be a voltage effect. And that's why I titled the book The Voltage Effect, because a lot of ideas that we have work here, and then up in the large, the benefit cost profile is just terrible. Deteriorates, but it deteriorates in a predictable way. So that's kind of the way I would think about it, is if we can be better at doing option C thinking back here, then I think we can have a lot of confidence to say, I've checked out 2 of your constraints, and this works with those 2 constraints in place, so let's give it a go. That's where I think the future needs to go, not only in philanthropy, but so Sir from Brazil is exactly the point that I was making to you. That's a general insight now that we can explore in philanthropy and talk about scaling, and then that's going to go to every program you can think about, that option C thinking. Thanks for your question.
I want to follow up a little bit on both of you. One of the things that makes science a science is that if you get a result, someone else can get the same result. You have to replicate. The academic incentives for replicating are near zero, because journals don't like to publish things that don't surprise them. And either you'll find, yes, the study was good, then you're the 10th study to find it, or no, there seems to be no effect, in which case they say, it's uninteresting if there's no effect. So Renee Beckers and Florentine Meyer initiated and invited me to join them on a special issue of the journal Voluntas, dedicated to publishing replication studies, whether they find an effect or no effect in philanthropic studies and philanthropy. And I've left papers describing this special issue around I hope those of you who are professors will tell your students. Those of you who are practitioners wanting to do an experiment who think it worked there but it wouldn't work for us, that's a replication study. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping to encourage them. Yeah. Thanks.
No, that's wonderful.
Those replicating the Anya Samek finding would be interesting, because it hasn't so far filtered into behavior. People are not making fewer thank you calls, right? So there seems to be something that could be done there.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. But I think, I talk about the 5 hurdles, or the 5 vital signs of scaling. Vital sign number 1 is replication. We tend to try stuff and advance stuff before we know with much more reliability or certainty that it's true. So I think I applaud you for joining that effort. That's exactly what we need to do as scientists.
And the replication definition we're using is broader than just that. It is to modify the compare the experiment as conducted with slight modifications that may can apply in other
Yeah.
situations, or with does it scale, or lots of other things.
Absolutely.
So since we're giving plugs for journals, I'm an editor at the Journal of Behavioral Public Administration. Our nonprofit editor is Diana Mason. This is two parts. So one of them, we also welcome replications and we welcome null results, as long as it's a powered null result, as long as the replication is well done. And we have actually published some replication studies of field experiments, even though they find the same thing as the original experiment. We are owned by the American Political Science Association. We were founded by Ken Meyer. We are pretty fast turnaround. The papers are about 10 pages long. We're almost fully indexed at this point. So strongly recommend any nonprofit people to consider us as an outlet because we consider public administration, nonprofit to be part of public administration.
Absolutely. I love this. We have some power brokers in the room.
If I could go back to
I like it. Thank you.
Just the nonprofit perspective of partnering, because I heard you say, like, how would I feel if I came to them and my results didn't come back? Nonprofits are looking for support in that space. Like when you're talking about constraints, time, staff, capacity, and desire to make an impact, all make it ripe for the desire for that partnership to grow. You can see that because nonprofits are constantly hiring consultants to help drive in this space. So I think even if you approach this as in a way where it's talking to them like you're trying to deliver ROI to help them inform their decisions and not just make it about like my desire to publish, I think nonprofits are going to be incredibly receptive. And if you help them identify something that doesn't work, that's just going to save them time as well. So even a null finding is going to be meaningful to them.
No, that's an interesting idea. Maybe it's very simple in my mind is that we should have been talking about this as pro bono consulting rather than partnerships, which we've been trying to explain. Maybe this is just kind of a consulting agreement that is, for which we have some funding, and instead of having a professional consultant, you're having a scholar serve as your consultant.
Right.
That's one way of describing it too, I guess, right? Martin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've been to CASE, which is, of course, a conference for practitioners in higher education. But there's a superbly obvious difference between the presentations that are happening. And this is not a criticism, just an observation. In Erin Meyer, she's a person who studies culture, and she has this thing called the culture map. And one of her measures of difference in culture is principles first versus application first. And what I find with the academic presentations is very often principles first, where it is about how do we get to this, whereas in practitioner land, it's very often application first. Like, how is this going to make your life better? Or how is this going to help? And what I find is that sometimes in practitioner's mind, because I can speak from that with most experience, is that it's sometimes hard to connect what the research is saying to how I'm going to change my life on Monday morning. And I think the big advantage the consultants have is because they speak that language. Like, how are you going to change your life on Monday morning, doing the work and doing it better? Even though the researchers could actually have, evidence-based changes that you should be making, like, for example, what we saw this morning with the locality in the networks. I thought it was like a mind-blowing thing to see. But basically, like, there may be a translational issue that can be fixed by a little bit of like a translational effort, so that the difference, the distance between the practitioner and the researcher can be slight. Because, John, what you were saying about, like, we want to make the world a better place, yeah, absolutely. That's why I'm here. I know that there's a lot of really important things. But I do also know that there's fewer practitioners here than I think should be here, because there's a lot of people who could really, really benefit from this. And I think, getting more in the space where we translate that research in a way that can be practically applied would be incredibly helpful.
I think that's a great point. And to me, it summarizes well the incentive disconnect that academics have on the one hand, which is to do something that is theory first, principles, test it, and it's very literature driven, versus this. I mean, you could wake up Monday morning with this and say, okay, now I have something that's actionable. That got published in a good journal back in 2007. The question is could that same paper today get published in a good journal? It did back then because it was new. So if we have enough, quote, new things that are directly at the frontier of where a practitioner is, like, do matches matter? That you should all care about that. Do seeds matter? You should care. Does an upfront gift matter? These are like 3 ideas that are all in top 5 econ journals. So if those continue to come, that's what I envision this about, is that practitioners have questions like that academics haven't thought about. And then the practitioners already have the platform set up, right? That's your comparative advantage, is you have a platform set up. The reason why I'm chief economist at Walmart is because they have a platform set up. They have 4,700 stores. That's my field experimental paradise. And now I don't have to set up like at baseball card conventions like I did in the 90s to make my market. That's what all of you have. You have the platforms already invested in, the fixed costs already sunk. We have a bunch of people who have a bunch of human capital and would love to apply that human capital to what all of you have brought to the table. That's what I call gains to trade. But I do think that there are a lot of those apples that are still on the tree, like this one, or like the gifts one. Like I could give you an entire 5 slide decks that you were saying I could stand by the water cooler tomorrow and talk to my people about it, and they should know this stuff. I think that those types of ideas can continue to come with interactions like this. But right now, the incentives are set up to where an academic will do something that's literature driven. The practitioner will see it and say, I can't make the connection. Like, it's cool and it's kind of neat, and they're saying words that I only understand half of. The guy hasn't learned to stop speaking economese, but that's okay because it's kind of cute. But I've just wasted 2 days of my life because I can go back and I can't do anything with it besides tell a few stories about guys who I met, gals who I met, whatever. I think that's a part that needs to change to make this a really successful collaboration, and something, frankly, that you can see it right in front of you, how the incentives are not aligned. But if you get the right mix of people and the right incentives and change with incentives ourselves by adding resources to the game, then that's our idea about how to change those relationships. But you're spot on in terms of what we face as a group to try to change the world.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way of summing things up. But before we go, I want to make sure that you know that we're going to continue this conversation. We have folks who have already filled out an interest in partnering. But before we break into and thanks Stephanie and John for their wonderful contributions, can I have a hands up of all of our practitioners who'd be interested in talking during the break with a scholar and continuing this conversation? Practitioners, so take a look around. If you're a scholar, you have willing partners here, people who are part of this community that's trying to change the incentives. And that's one of the reasons we have non-economists also involved, because some of us think incentives are more malleable than economists do. So that's an opportunity for us here in this conversation. So do continue the conversation. If we haven't heard about your problem and your obstacle, please make sure that you send it in the follow-up communication that we have. But we'll try to do some matching. We do have some funding which helps offset conventional incentives to help lubricate these relationships as we go forward. But please obviously thank John and Stephanie for this wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Continues, but